Welcome to the 2023 Fleeceling Quilt Along. I'm Laura Struck from Made Peachy, and over this series of videos we're going to work towards creating a sampler quilt. This 9-block sampler quilt features a selection of products from the Fleeceling quilting range, and each video will walk you through the process of start to finish to create each unique quilting block. Block number 4 in the sampler quilt is a pixel block, and this has been made using Fleeceling Quilter's Grid. Block number 4 in the sampler quilt is a pixel block, and that is made using Quilter's Grid. So the supplies we're going to need are going to be a cutting mat, a rotary cutter and ruler, some scissors with a sharp point, a selection of fabrics in dark and light tones, and some Quilter's Grid. With the rotary cutter and ruler we want to trim the fabrics. We need to create 3-inch squares, so I need to create 4 of the 3-inch squares in the light fabric and 5 of the 3-inch squares in the darker fabric. Once the fabric's been cut, you need to cut a piece of the Quilter's Grid, and that needs to measure 9 inches by 9 inches, or 9 grid squares across by 9 grid squares down. Fleeceling Quilter's Grid is a fusible interlining that's ideal for patchwork and quilting. On one side we have a 1-inch grid which is printed on in a brown tone, and on the other side is the adhesive side. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the grid lines to place our fabric pieces. So working with our light and dark fabrics, we're going to place them following the grid lines to create our design. So onto the adhesive side we're going to position our fabrics in our chosen design. If you're working with a fabric that has an orientation, be sure to choose exactly how you'd like it to appear on your finished block. And once all the fabrics are in place, we're going to fuse them onto the Quilter's Grid. Once we're happy with the placement of all of our fabrics, we can fuse them onto the Quilter's Grid. To do this, I'm first of all going to dampen my Fleeceling iron-on cloth. Now this is a specialist pressing cloth which will allow me to accurately press my fabrics, protecting my fabrics and also my iron at the same time. So this Fleeceling iron-on cloth has been dampened and I can see through, so I can see that my fabrics haven't moved when I've placed the cloth down, which you don't often see with a regular pressing cloth. So the cloth is slightly dampened and I'm working with a dry iron, so no steam is being used on my iron, and I'm using a medium setting, so the number 2 dots on the iron. And to fuse the fabrics onto the Quilter's Grid, we're going to press the iron on and hold it in place and then lift and press the next section. So it's taking time to lift and press the iron across the work, ensuring that all of the fabrics are fused into place. When all of our fabrics have been fused, we can remove the pressing cloth. Obviously, because we've been working with an iron, all of our materials will still remain quite warm. Our fabrics are now fused onto the Quilter's Grid, and we do need to leave that to cool. So I'm going to remove it from my pressing pads and pop it onto the table. Now I'm going to leave it for 30 minutes to cool, and this is going to allow the fabrics to fully bond with the Quilter's Grid. Once our block is cooled, we can then go on to stitch our seams. So on this design, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be stitching the vertical seams first and then follow with the horizontal seams. So we're going to be making our seam placement where the fabrics meet. What we're going to do is we're going to be using the grid line on the reverse of the work, and we are going to carefully fold and finger press. If you like, you can pop a couple of clips onto the folded edge to hold the work secure while you take it to the sewing machine. At the sewing machine, we're going to be working a straight line of stitching that runs the whole length of this section here. So we're using our fold as the side, and our 1/4-inch seam is going to run from this folded edge to here. So my needle is set 1/4 inch in, and I'm working with a straight stitch, and I'm using a 2mm stitch length. I'm going to take my seam all the way along, removing my clips as I go. I'm using a 50 weight thread. This is nice and light and it won't add any additional bulk in the seams. I'm just carefully working all the way to the end. I'm using an 80 size needle, so this is a nice sharp new needle for my project. Returning from the machine, we can see we've got a straight line of stitching that runs 1/4 of an inch from the folded edge, and that's worked on the quilter's grid side. And if we open up the block, we can see we've now got a lovely neat seam that is formed where these blocks meet. Our second seam is going to run vertically along this portion. So again, we are going to be using the grid on the reverse side, on the quilter's grid side, and carefully finger press into place and add some clips before stitching. So the second vertical seam has been stitched in exactly the same way, working 1/4 of an inch from the folded edge, and opening out we can see that we've got now the 2 completed vertical sections. We're going to go on and sew the 2 horizontal seams. Again, this is done in exactly the same manner. We're going to be folding over using the grid as a guide. And what you'll notice here is we've got a rather bulky connection point on our joins of fabrics. So in order to lighten that up a little bit, we're going to carefully, with the piece folded and taking the sharp scissors, just work a small cut into that fold, and that is going to allow us to nest our seams. So I'll work onto the second portion of that seam, using the scissors just to make a small cut on the grid line. Now being really careful not to cut those stitches. So here I'm using the grid line, and that is going to be where I want my seam to run, and I'm just going to push part of the seam allowance to one side, and it forms a nest there, so it's not too bulky. I'm going to pop a clip on, and again in the same way I'm going to move the seam allowance on one portion to one side and on the other portion to the other side. And I can then just give the rest of the seam finger press and take across to the sewing machine to complete that line of stitching. Here at the machine I'm going to work my 1/4 inch seam again from this folded edge, and carefully ensuring that those joining seams there are nested. So working a straight stitch all the way along, removing any clips and pins, and just easing through the machine there and completing the last portion of that seam. The first horizontal seam has been worked here, and we've made sure that the seams are nested to take away the bulk. We're going to repeat the process to create this final horizontal seam. With the second and final horizontal seam having been worked and our seams neatly nested here on the intersection of the fabrics, we can open out our block and reveal the design. So here we've got the lovely neat placement and perfectly placed seams. Just returning our block back to our pressing mat, we can just work carefully over those seams just to press everything out nice and neatly, ready for quilting. Be sure to check out the other videos in the series to create all 9 blocks of your sampler quilt. You can find our Quilt as you go method video in the series also, and this will show you how to piece together your finished sampler quilt. Thank you so much for joining me for the Vliesleen 2023 Quilt Along. You can find out more about the Vliesleen products on the Vliesleen website at vliesleen.com, and you can follow us on social media on Facebook, Instagram and YouTube at Vliesleen UK. You can find me online at madepeachy.com. Please do share your projects online and tag us in your makes. We do love to see them.